introduce John Pennett. He's a partner at EisnerAmper, great accounting firm. He's the partner in charge of the National Technology and Life Science Industry Group, and he's got well over 35 years of experience here in the industry and capital markets. And he's going to talk to us this afternoon about fundraising strategies for life sciences. So I look forward to hearing about that. As a former NYSE alum, always an interesting capital raising and fundraising, always an interesting topic for me. So John, why don't you take over, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks for having me here. Let me just share my screen here. Well, thanks again for inviting us to participate in this event. And I listened in earlier today on a couple of the other presentations, some really interesting speakers with some really terrific and dynamic ideas. So one of the things I think that everyone's going to need to help achieve those goals and objectives is to have some cash. So hopefully we can give you a few tidbits here, a couple things to think about as you go down your journey of raising money for your organization. So let's just see if this is advancing properly here. Okay, terrific. So I'm just going to introduce ourselves very quickly here. We'll talk a little bit about why is this important? Why is this presentation important? And a couple of things you should think about as you go on the fundraising journey, including thinking about the amount of capital to raise, how to present yourself appropriately to a venture capitalist or other investor. What do venture capitalists look for? And what does it take to kind of be diligence ready? And of course, the house phone would ring in the middle of the presentation.
It's probably a car warranty company, so don't worry.
It expired again. I just renewed it. That's not possible. Anyway, I'll just put it on mute here for a second while that finishes. I guess we're done. Here's just a thumbnail sketch about EisnerAmper and who we are. So we're, as Glenn had mentioned, we're one of the large accounting firms across the country. We've got over 2,000 employees now, and our technology industry practice is one of our cornerstone practices for the firm. We've got locations all around the globe, and we see in our technology practice that the international flair of the requirements of the companies are almost always present. There's either resources, talent is global, so you need to be able to access that talent. Customers are global as well. And of course, the services that we offer to companies include auditing and tax, and advisory services, outsourced bookkeeping, and the clients that we serve range from embryonic startups through companies that have gone into the public marketplace already. But the middle of the bell curve of our client base tends to be early venture capital, Series A, Series B sized companies. So they're going through the entrepreneurial journey. And from my perspective, that's one of the fun parts of the practice, and being the leader of the practice is helping companies go on that entrepreneurial journey. I'm also privately, I'm also an angel investor. I'm a member of Mid-Atlantic BioAngels, which is a life sciences only focused angel group. And I've also done some investing in the healthcare IT space. Okay. So to get into the presentation a little bit, so why is this presentation important? So as entrepreneurs think about the journey that they're about to embark upon, you have to understand it's really hard work, and it's far more common to see a company that is not successful than one that is successful, especially for first-time entrepreneurs. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned by first-time entrepreneurs. Later on, after if they have not been successful, or whether they were successful, the lessons learned make them a lot more attractive to venture capitalists down the road. So having gone through that learning experience is super critical to giving people a sense of comfort that you can do this. But you have to understand that 90% of all startup organizations ultimately fail, and most of them fail within the first year. Sometimes it's because there hasn't been enough work done to really understand the marketplace, whether there's really a need for that company, whether the competition's already farther ahead of you. So people jump in, then they do some research and say, well, maybe we're not as far along as we thought. There are people way ahead of us, or that they just haven't been able to really attract the type of capital that they need to be successful. Running out of capital, is it's one of the main reasons why companies are not successful. So almost 30% of companies, the failure rate is because of running out of capital. So you have to understand what the business is, what you need to get the business to be successful, and then be able to convince capitalists to invest in the company. Being a venture capitalist is hard. They receive an enormous amount of proposals each year. And we're going to talk a little bit later on about what venture capitalists look for. So it's really hard to differentiate yourself from the mass quantities of proposals that they receive. Certainly, if you can get a warm introduction to a venture capitalist, you're going to be far better off than just sending things into the transient. So you want to be as prepared as you can and take advantage of whatever networks you have, whether it's your law firms, board members, academic advisors, your accountants, anybody who can help you with those introductions to the right venture capitalist. And that's really critical, is the right ones, is certainly something you should take advantage. So we'd all like to think that our company is going to become a unicorn, right? So we see the quantity of companies who've become unicorns has increased every year. Would certainly be something that would be, exceptionally cool. I wish I could think of a great idea that's going to become a unicorn company, but it's really hard. And ultimately, almost, very, very few companies will actually get to that point. So you have to understand, what's realistic goals as well, what's realistic valuations. And of course, we'll talk about valuations a little bit later on. That can be a topic of an entire 2 or 3 day session just by itself, is to think about valuations. But you have to understand what your possibility could be if things are successful for you. And I think this quotation here that was included in Forbes is I think is a really important criteria to think about, which is what is the criteria for a successful startup? They have a product that meets a need, they don't ignore anything, they grow fast, and they recover from the hard knock lives of startup life. Right. So being a startup is a hard process. You have to learn fast. You have to pay really close attention to the details, and hopefully the product that you have and the market that you're going after is significant. Okay. So a couple of things to think about before you go into the fundraising mode. So one thing that we hear often is entrepreneurs do not want to dilute themselves. They do not want to give up ownership. They do not want to give up control. Ultimately, if you're going to be successful, you are going to have to raise money. You are going to have to give up some degree of ownership and perhaps even control at some point in time. So the transition from a technologist who has a good idea and is trying to develop a technology to a commercializable company, product ready for launch, ready to put into the clinic. It's a different skill set. So ultimately, you're going to have to dilute your ownership percentage, and perhaps dilute your power base as well. And neither of those things could be perceived as a bad thing. In fact, if you're successful, they would actually be perceived as good things. So it's a hard mindset for people to get over. I think the biggest challenge for people getting over that is fear, and fear that the fear is really that maybe I'm not quite as talented as I think I am, and I'm afraid that somebody may be able to do a better job. It's a hard thing to overcome, but if you can get there, I think that's a really good thing. So the second point I want to just take a couple moments to talk about is how much money do you raise? Okay. So in the life sciences world, we know that there are many steps along the process to enter into the clinic, to go through the clinic, to come out of the clinic on the other side. And each time you successfully achieve some of the objectives along that timeline, you've de-risked the company to some degree. And depending on which milestone you've actually met over the course of that time, you may be creating a significant amount of risk decrease that's occurred, and therefore that may have given an incremental bump to your valuation. So when I think about for a life sciences company, how much money should you raise? To me, that it starts with command and control of the clinical pathway, including the budget and the timeline. And then you make sure that you raise enough money to achieve an important series of objectives, make sure you have enough to finish those objectives and be able to get the readout from that objective. So if you're going through tox studies, you're going through animal studies, make sure you have enough money to complete it. And if you're successful, you've now taken some risks off the table. Your valuation should be higher, and you should be able to go out and raise money at a new, higher level base. So you want to raise the amount of money that you need to achieve that, not necessarily the amount of money that you want, and certainly not the amount of money that you would need to complete all of the clinical activities to get the product ready for launch. Okay, but at the end of the day, having command and control of that budget is ultimately critical to get you to that stage, so you can clearly articulate the need for the funds that you're asking for. To me, when I listen to an entrepreneur and I ask them about the budget and the milestone, if they can't clearly articulate the process and the funding and the timeline, then I'm not even sure they understand the clinical pathway, let alone how much money they should be raising and at what valuation. So I put a lot of question into whether that entrepreneur has thought their way through the clinical process enough and is really investment ready at that point in time. So one of the things that we often see when we look at these budgets and timelines that people put together is their budget for people. And so while it certainly is great early on to, in your bootstrapping stage, to include consultants wherever you can, and it's a great idea to give some equity to some of the key participants, it takes a long time and a lot of money to raise the human capital levels that you need. Culture is super important to an organization. Talent is hard to find. It's hard to recruit. There's high demand for talented people. And I think when you look at the successful companies, they're bringing in talent around them. So you always want to surround yourself with smarter people than you are. That takes time and money, and it needs to really be built into the plan. I think when you look at the plan and you look at the process of how it's going to develop, you don't necessarily need to have all the pieces in place when you go and talk to venture capitalists, but you need to have a plan in place to get them in place and be willing to talk to the smartest people that you can find. Okay. That'll help you understand your cash burn and ultimately how long and which processes you can successfully start with the funds you've raised. Investors are funny people, right? So, you look at how the market has been over the last couple of years here now, and there certainly is what I would call a FOMO effect, right? So a fear of missing out on the next gene editing company, the next COVID company. There's a lot of companies that people have been sort of looking at and saying, what should we do here? And I don't want to miss out on this. So, okay. So just sort of sticking a little bit here with the concept of raising the right amount of capital here. So if you raise too much money and if you raise money at too high of a valuation, you've put yourself in potentially some difficult situations. So oftentimes we'll see a friends and family round where someone will come in and they'll purchase shares of stock at probably an unreasonably high pre-money valuation. Okay. What that does is when you go to the next round, because it's a friend and family, they were fine with it, they trust you, et cetera. But that kind of puts you in an awkward position because when you go back to investors for your next round of financing, you're thinking you're going to get an up round or at least an equal round to where you were. But if that round was not reasonable, now you're going to have to go and explain that. And you're also going to have to explain to your uncle who helped finance you the first time through why they're going to have to be repriced and kind of create a whole down round situation. Kind of awkward. And if you can avoid doing it, that's great. So early on, it's nice that your rich uncle will help you and not ask too many questions about valuation, but don't make it so unreasonable that the unwind is problematic. There's also a scenario where you see where companies raise too much capital. And that's been a problem in a number of situations where, the investor has felt like the entrepreneur has gotten a little bit lost their edge, a little bit lazy in the process. a little bit of overspending, overthinking, working too far ahead of where you are currently. So no reason to think about your commercial team and building your commercial team out if you're still in a preclinical stage. And I think it just sort of creates sort of just that the sharpness of the organization can be it can be lost a little bit there. Um, so I like the idea of kind of raising money to meet the specific objectives that you have at hand. So identify what your clinical pathway is, raise the money to finish some important things so you can get to that next key value inflection point. If you can reach that point and you're doing it at a reasonably fair valuation, you're in great shape. So let's take a couple moments here and talk about what does a venture capitalist look for, and we'll go through this in the next couple slides here. So team and TAM, that's sort of always the number one thing. So the team, I have to believe as a potential investor that regardless of the science, that this team can execute the plan that's set forth and be successful in taking that asset to its ultimate exit strategy stage. If I don't feel like that team can achieve that objective, then the investment is not worthwhile, because either it's not going to happen or I'm going to have to go through the painful process of trying to convince often a scientific founder that they're going to have to be replaced by somebody who can make this happen. Very difficult decisions to do. So you really want to have members of your team that can help push this through. Part of that is also making sure that you have access to advisors who can help you through this process. So not everyone is on payroll at this point in time, perhaps, but you certainly want to have people in the wing and advising you and being a voice when you're talking to the investors. Okay. And TAM is certainly, that's the total addressable market, right? So the bigger the opportunity, the more disruptive, the better the opportunity for the venture capitalist. Certainly if you're in a medical device or certain types of diagnostic fields, the market may be by definition a little bit limited. But if it's a therapeutic, you typically think of, pretty significant markets in place. Obviously, the bigger the market, the more the opportunity for the company to make money. Excuse me. So I want to spend a couple moments here and just talk about, sort of like how a venture capitalist looks at deals. Okay. So venture capital is the highest risk category for asset classes that institutional investors participate in. Therefore, they would expect to have the highest returns. So you look at it at an S&P 500 plus S&P 500 plus 500 basis points as a rough target. That means they want to make 7 times their invested capital in 7 years. That's a lot of money. But you think about if you look at venture capital funds kind of across the spectrum of both technology and life sciences, it really is a very skewed and kind of theoretically flawed model because most of them make almost all of their returns on a couple of investments, whereas the other investments in the portfolio, about a third of them kind of break even, and a third of them are losses or maybe even zeros. But there's just a few that tend to really drive the returns of those investment portfolios. So they're really trying very hard to limit their downside and try to pick the winners in that process. So really difficult model, which is why they put you all through so much grilling as they go through the process. Same thing happens, I'm, as mentioned, I'm an angel investor. We go through the same process there. We want to be thought of as an important investor. So if you're looking at angel investors and you tell me you're eventually going to need $100 million for your phase 3 CNS trial, we're going to be, as an angel investor, we'll be completely unimportant long before you get to that phase 3 trial. Those are not very attractive investments to angels because they take too long. We become diluted away to nothing, and you still have, the enormous, risk of, the 1 in 10,000 compounds making it ultimately to a commercializable drug. So those are tough investments. But one of the things that we are seeing more and more of is the model where venture capitalists or corporate venture capital will put together a scenario where they'll do sort of a on-demand investment type of an arrangement. So um, we're going to set up a company, or maybe not even set up a company. We're going to acquire some technology. We're going to fund it to do specific clinical trials or preclinical activities, and we're going to treat them as a binary outcome. It either works or it doesn't work. If it works, we'll give you the money for the next trial. If it doesn't work, we'll give it back to the university. We'll give it back to the NIH and say, work on it some more. We'll talk to you later on. So that's become a very unemotional. You don't have to deal with people. You don't have to deal with companies. There's no leases, no processes. So very, very virtualized, very unemotional type of process. But it's a way to figure out if you're going to fail early and fail cheap. So I haven't spent a lot of money, and I've been able to get the answer to the question, whatever that answer is going to be. Okay. So thinking about valuations. So, we're often asked as an accounting firm, can you come and help us create a valuation for our company? Can you do a valuation that we can take to venture capitalists and say, this is what we should use as our pre-money valuation? And although we're certainly willing to take the money, I always suggest to them the answer should be no. This is an art, not a science. And so our view would be no better than anybody else's view, which is ultimately not going to be what the ultimate deal terms are going to be. It's a negotiation. You're looking at the market opportunities, the management teams, the TAM. You're looking at how far along are you? How many of these steps have you de-risked in the process? What does the competition look like? So while there are rough rules of thumb to say, if you're in a preclinical stage, if you've finished animal studies, you're at phase 1, you could be between X and Y if you're in an oncology indication or things like that. They're really just rules of thumb. So you should have an idea. You should know what those rules of thumb are. You should look at the competitive landscape. You should understand what competitors are out there and what deals they've done and what those deal metrics are. And that helps you to determine what you think your pre-money valuation is, at least what the range of that pre-money valuation should be. But that's all it really gives you. It just gives you what that range could be, especially at the early stage. It's really hard to pin a much more specific number on it than that. So I don't think it's typically worth a lot of effort to try to make it more precise. But you definitely need to know who your competition is and the deals that they've done, and be able to speak to them in a fair degree of clarity when you have a potential investor meeting. So here's another slide where we could spend an entire day probably talking about the different financing structures. We'll do this in 2 or 3 minutes instead. So basically thinking about what investors are looking for. So they'll start off with, often we'll see a convertible note or a safe instrument as a starting point. Really good ideas, because what it does is it defers the decision on what the valuation is going to be. It pushes that decision down the road. So you're raising money. It's typically one of the earliest non-friends and family investment dollars you have in. So a lot of times you'll see angels do this, or seed investors. And typically, rather than fighting over what the valuation will be, is they'll give you basically the opportunity to get your funding. It'll be a debt instrument, but convertible into equity at the next round of financing, typically with a discount to that round, representing some of the earlier risk that was taken by these investors. But it does give you the opportunity to achieve some of those milestone important scientific advances that you need to get to in order to reach those critical milestones, and perhaps reach the valuation that you think you should be worth. You now have much more ammunition to convince other people of that. And then once you kind of get to that stage, then you'll be doing some sort of a convertible, often a convertible preferred round to start. And that, of course, will have some liquidation preferences, and also will be convertible to common stock. Usually at that stage, you'll take a board seat as well, at least some board seats. At your convertible debt stage, they may or may not, depending on the circumstances. So I'm going to kind of skip over this at this point in time, because I think, again, we could spend a lot more time on this. But I think the key thing is, it's okay to start off with the convertible debt instrument or the SAFE, to kind of push those valuation topics down the road. Okay. So when you get the opportunity to meet an investor, you want to be diligence ready. So I'm going to start off with a small story here. So I was asked by one of my partners to introduce a biotech entrepreneur to a legendary character in the biotech world, one of the earliest and most successful biotech entrepreneurs. And so as a person who I know, so I say I'll be happy to set up the meeting, which I did. And the entrepreneur was kind of nervous about meeting him and said, would I be willing to come along to the meeting, which I agreed to. So we're meeting, the three of us are meeting, and the entrepreneur starts off his conversation with, okay, so this is a cell. A cell has a wall, and there's stuff that's important that's inside the wall. So I'm an accountant. So I'm saying, hold on a second, let me write this down. This is really helpful here. I'm not a biologist. This is good reminders for me. And I realized that, he's talking to somebody who, wrote the book on this, 70 years ago, probably. And so the meeting was very short and very unsuccessful. So the moral of the story is know who your investors are, know who you're talking to, do your homework. If you're looking for a seed investor, if you go to Deerfield, they're not seed investors. If you're looking for, a $10 million financing, don't go to an angel. That's just not the right group. So pick the right investors for the amount of money that you need to raise. Do your homework, make sure that they're investing in the types of things that you're doing. So we see a lot of things that are sort of AI driven. So some of the life sciences investors are very much not into the technology side of things. They don't understand it. They don't know how it works. Some folks are like the diagnostic, companion diagnostic. Some people don't. So really spend the time, identify who has been investing in the area that you're focused on, and try to target those folks, and then stay away from the ones that are not investing at the stage or in the therapeutic categories that you're working on. And again, take advantage of whomever you can find in your network to help you with the introductions to those relevant people, and be really focused. You want to make sure your house is generally in order before you really embark on this pathway. So if you want to have conversations early on with investors, let them know what you're doing. Start the dialogue in the conversation. I think those are great ideas. And I think what that allows you to do is to come back later as you're achieving some of your objectives and pushing forward on that. And as a result of that, you'll be able to continue to have a dialogue, and you won't be just something brand new when the time comes. So I think that's a good idea. But you want to have your deal room put together. Particular areas of focus that I would say that are really important is your cap table. So get your cap table clearly documented, get all your documents in place, get them signed, executed. I've been deposed 3 different times over fights over whether a founder was entitled to X or Y percentage of the company because it was never documented. And those are things that are just not answerable and cause tremendous amount of bad will in the process. So I think that's really critical that you get those in place. The tax and accounting ramifications of not having those in place and doing it at the earliest possible date are often very painful. So you want to do those things as early as you could. Okay. Make sure you get your taxes are current. Pay your payroll taxes. Do all the things you should be doing there. IP, obviously, super critical. Get your license, your patents clearly documented. We as angel investors, we often run across companies that are in the process of negotiating their license from the university. And that's okay. And sometimes we'll even help provide some funding to do that initial down payment. But that's something that's really got to be clear. Negotiations have to start. We have to have an idea what we're looking at. Is this a $200,000 spend or a $2 million spend? Obviously, your corporate governance documents, pick the right form of your corporation or LLC, whatever it's going to be, get all the paperwork in place. And to the extent that you have customers, and I should have included in here also, critical vendor agreements, make sure those are also in here if you have CROs, CDMOs, whatever the case may be. When you look at the financial statement side of things, historical financials for early stage life sciences companies don't mean a whole lot, to be honest with you. I think as someone who does diligence on these companies for our angel group, we want to see that you have them and that you've met the, let's call it the minimum requirements. We're not expecting you to be, SEC ready at this point. But what probably is more important is the projections. So again, kind of a clear and concise understanding of the clinical pathway and the budget it's going to take to get there each step along the way. To the extent that you are already in a commercial stage, obviously the key metrics for your particular business is super critical. So if it's more of a software oriented business and things like, monthly recurring revenue, churn rate for typical SaaS type companies or health IT companies, whatever those metrics are, you want to have, again, clear understanding and presentation of those. Okay. And also, I think as you get towards the commercialization stage, the fixed versus variable cost element becomes really critical. So oftentimes, like at that stage, maybe a private equity firm might be looking to add you to the mix of some other things that they're doing. And so they would have the perspective that I can drive more revenue to you, but I really need to know what your fully burdened cost of goods sold is. So I can, if we can drive more sales, what's our profitability going to look like? So it's really just, setting up that deal room. The electronic deal rooms work really well, and just having all these things in order. Do it right from the start. It's not too hard and not too expensive, and it'll save you a lot of grief down the road. Okay. So just to finish on a couple of thoughts here. So there's some alternatives to getting kind of the traditional angel seed investor venture capital financing strategy. So obviously most companies start off with bootstrapping, deferring their salaries or taking reduced salaries for a period of time as long as necessary. We as potential investors, we really appreciate that. There's often some hard decisions that have to be made about whether you're ever going to get paid those salaries or not, but at least have them on the table as something to talk about. We've seen some very, very creative equipment financing opportunities out there. So I think if you do need equipment for your lab, think about how that might be able to be procured. The shared facilities in terms of incubators, the shared office space, the fully managed office spaces are some great opportunities there. Most states have, in many countries as well, have tax incentive programs designed to help entrepreneurs. So ask the questions. So some of them are tax driven, some of them are employment or other innovation driven. So definitely look for all of those that you can. Obviously, government grants across many spectrums, NIH, local grants, Department of Defense, et cetera. The loan programs that were put in place during the COVID shutdowns to help with stability, they weren't designed to be innovative programs to help spur innovation, but they were designed for stability. So those were good things. We see some crowdfunding in certain markets. I would say not a terribly popular topic for most life sciences companies. But if it is more of a consumer slant or a therapeutic area where there's been a significant lack of advancement, like Alzheimer's, for an example, or something where it's disease specific, we have seen some activity there. It's got its pros and cons, but it's sometimes potentially worth looking at if it's other venues are struggling. Obviously, there's joint ventures and strategic alliances with larger companies, usually as the as you advance further. And of course, the IPO and SPAC market has been super hot, so that's been quite strong, and well, hopefully that continues into the future here. So here's just my contact information. And I think with that, I will turn it back to Glenn and see where we go next.
All right. Now, John, thank you. Very, very thoughtful, very thorough, very, very complete. You touched on a lot of points, and you did some nice connectivity for us, because we had a previous presentation on the importance of the cap table earlier in the week, as well as a discussion on corporate venture capital kind of facilities. One quick question, just to you mentioned a little bit in passing NIH and universities in a general term. How in a life science space, do you see, and I know it's the wrong word, but say partnerships with those types of entities in this space, or is that where the talent is coming from, or the IP? What do you think?
So certainly a lot of the IP is coming from the NIH labs and from research professors and their labs. And they are often the technology is spun out of those organizations and put into a separate company. So there's a license agreement that's put in place there. And then typically what also or sometimes happens as well is that separate company will enter into a services arrangement with the university or the NIH to perform certain tests on their behalf, because maybe that's where the talent lies to continue to advance the science. Certainly the NIH is providing grants in many cases as well. And so sometimes the grants are being issued directly to the university, sometimes to the company. Sometimes the NIH is doing the tests themselves on behalf, and the company has the right to use the results of those things. So there's some very collaborative efforts to continue to advance those.
All right, terrific. Well, listen, thanks for joining us. Very, very much appreciated your time and your presentation today. Very, very informative. Lot of great advice here for the companies and the entrepreneurs listening today. So thanks so much. Have a good evening and much success in the future. Okay.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, Glenn.